اللهم صل على سيدنا
Welcome everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about the early history of the Swahili and in particular its golden age. I am Judy Aldrich and I have been specialising in the history of East Africa for over 40 years. The so-called Golden Age of the Swahili lasted for a period of just over 300 years, between circa 1200 and 1600 AD. It was a time when the Indian Ocean stood at the epicentre of the known world and acted as the crossroads of a large and mainly peaceful trading zone. Business was profitable and coastal inhabitants lived in well-ordered urban settlements and enjoyed the fruits of success. Geographical position determines much of history, and the most important fact about the Swahili coast is its place alongside the Indian Ocean. Long ago, sailors in this part of the world noticed that for 4 or 5 months the wind would blow from one direction and then change and blow from the opposite direction. This was an important discovery. It meant that sailors could plan to come from India, Persia and Arabia to East Africa with the northeast Kaskazi wind and return a few months later with the southwest Kuzi wind. This meant that goods could be traded and exchanged between these places in an organised way. Probably the first visitors to East Africa came from the Indus region, where one of the earliest civilizations in the world began. Traders from India and Egypt followed shortly afterwards. But of all the people who used the monsoon winds to sail in the Indian Ocean, the Arabs were the most influential group. Arabia lies between Africa and Asia and links the two continents. Over 2,000 years ago, goods from India and China were being brought to the ports of southern Arabia and then shipped on to Egypt and to East Africa. The first documented information we have of the East African coast comes from the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, written around the year 60 AD by a Greek sailor during the time of the Roman Empire. The word periplus means a traveller's guide, and the Erythraean Sea is the Greek for the Indian Ocean. It tells the reader what he would find if he sailed from the Red Sea southwards along the coast of East Africa and then back again to Arabia and the Persian Gulf. It is amazing to think how well informed the Romans were, and how, from their written information, we still can learn about them today. For the first time, we are given the names of ports situated along the East African coast. We are told of their exports and imports and given information about the people living there. The land of Africa is called Azania. Nowadays, we can only guess at the places described, as the names have all changed. The Periplus tells us the trading ships of that time came mainly from India or Arabia. From the northwest coast of India came wheat, rice, ghee, cotton cloth and sugar. From Arabia came metal goods and various kinds of glass. In the year 60 AD, the Red Sea port of Mocha in present-day Yemen was the main entrepot for trade. The Y of Yemen on my map marks its location. What did East Africa export? We are told ivory, slaves, spices, rhinoceros horn and timber from the coastal forests. Timber was an important commodity. It was the fuel of ancient times and was used in all shipbuilding and construction. In those times, the coast of Kenya was densely forested with a very small population. The Periplus tells us one more important piece of information. Many of the settlements along the East African coast had Arab traders living in them, and some even had Arab rulers. Also from the Periplus comes the first description of a metepe, the traditional sailing craft of the Swahili coast. These stone boats were primarily coasting vessels which stayed close to the shoreline, taking goods short distances from place to place. They were made from wooden planks, sewn and held together with coconut fibre twine and wooden plugs. No metal nails were used in their construction. They were large enough to carry mangrove poles, and the single square sail was made from plaited palm leaves. Metepe is a Bantu word meaning boat, which provides evidence that Bantu people were already living along the coast in 60 AD. Metepe was still being built in the traditional way until the early 20th century, especially in the Lamu area. But nowadays they sail no more and can only be seen as models exhibited in museums. In the early days, sailing ships stayed near the coast and did not venture out to sea for fear of shipwreck. But the seamen of the Indian Ocean became experts in the art of navigation and ship construction. Before the invention of compass, clock and sextant, they could find their latitude by looking at a known star and then accurately plot a course across the ocean. The use of lateen or triangular sails gave ocean-going dhows greater manoeuvrability than the square sails of the Metepe. Their streamlined design also made them faster and more seaworthy. This photograph of the dhow Triumph of Righteousness was taken in 1938 on Alan Villiers' famous voyage by dhow, which retraced the trade routes of the ancient times. Afterwards, he wrote down his adventures in a book he entitled Sons of Sinbad. Who were the sailors? This stylized painting from a 13th century Iraqi manuscript of an Indian Ocean trading ship provides a clue. The dark complexions of the captain, the sailors working the ropes of the sails, and the lookout boy at the top of the mast mark them out as Swahilis or Africans, in contrast to the pale-skinned merchants anxiously looking out from their cabin windows. Note what looks like a door being carried on board, and the decoration on the sail and ship sides. The picture probably depicts a storm at sea. Shipwreck was a real hazard of those times, and no wonder the passengers look worried. Here is another of Alan Villiers' photographs, showing a son of Sinbad working the ropes for the sails. It was hard work. Trade beads could once be picked up off the beaches of the East African coast in large numbers. Carnelian beads, pierced garnets, and glass beads. The beads are thought to date back many centuries, and the earliest to be of Persian or Indian manufacture. Business was all done by barter. Caravans from the interior came down to the coast, bringing ivory, slaves and cattle to exchange for beads, cotton cloth and cowrie shells. In the early days, the caravans would travel once a year and gather at a pre-arranged venue when they knew the arrival of the dhows was imminent. There would be an impromptu fair when goods were displayed and exchanged, and afterwards everyone would disperse. Later, permanent trading settlements were developed with storage facilities for trade goods, so business could be conducted without constraint. Some of the traders and sailors, perhaps delayed by ship repairs or waiting for favourable winds to speed them on their way, ended up settling and raising families in the pleasant surroundings of the East African coast. Little is known about the Swahili coast during the period between the fall of the Roman Empire and the coming of Islam. Direct contact with Europe ceased, and we have to turn to Islamic sources for information. Their reports show that the old trading habits continued unchanged, and Islam ushered in an increasingly prosperous and active era for the Swahili coast. East Africa, which had been called Azania by the Greeks, was now known as the land of Zenge. Zenge or Zanj means black in the Persian language. Gold was discovered in present-day Zimbabwe and exported from Sofala by the 12th century. This trade increased activity on the East African coast as it entered into its most profitable phase. The earliest archaeological evidence from the ruins of old Swahili settlements show that post holes indicating wooden structures existed beneath later stone mosques and buildings. It was a logical first step to build in wood before more permanently in stone. The trading settlements are usually situated near a protected bay where boats could be safely run up on the beach for unloading and loading goods. A discreet location on an offshore island was a favourite, affording protection from both land and sea. The Islamic religion proved so successful that in the first 80 years after the death of the Prophet, great swathes of people were converted and fired up with religious conviction. They conquered Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia and Egypt, and spread through North Africa as far as Spain, as well as along the coast of East Africa. At the head of this religious empire was the Caliph, or successor of the Prophet, but it was not long before quarrels broke out as to who was the rightful Caliph. These disputes divided Islam and caused some of those who'd been on the losing side to flee and take refuge on the pleasant coast of East Africa, with which they were already familiar. The legends about the identity of the Muslims who migrated to East Africa are confusing and often contradictory. One of the earliest tells the story of two brothers, Suleiman and Said, who fled from Oman and settled on the Lamu Islands. After the fall of the Umayyads in the 8th century, more settlers came, and the numbers continued to increase. Some came as refugees, fleeing war or religious persecution. Others came seeking new horizons and opportunities. Most of the main coastal towns have their own founding myths, but with the lack of written evidence, much uncertainty remains. One of the commonly recurring stories is that of 7 brothers who sailed down from the Persian Gulf in 7 ships and each founded a separate town. Mombasa, Pemba, Anjouan in the Comoro Islands, and Kilwa are 4 most commonly mentioned. We are told that Hassan bin Ali chose Kilwa and that he bought land in exchange for pieces of Indian cloth. He tied the lengths of cotton cloth end to end, and the area of land enclosed was then handed over in exchange for the cloth. cotton piece goods from India, forerunners of the modern kanga, had long been a favoured trade item, and most probably land was acquired in this way on a number of occasions. Coins found in Kilwa, recording the name of a local ruler called Ali bin Hassan, are presumed to be those of the descendant of the founding father Hassan bin Ali. They are very similar to coins from a province of Persia, now Iran, of which Shiraz was the capital. The Kilwa coins probably date to the 13th century and provide backup evidence for the claims of the oral history. A Portuguese historian, de Barros, writing in the 16th century, and a slightly later Arab writer also both cite the oral source and record that Kilwa was founded by a Shirazi dynasty called Al-Hassan. This is the nearest we have for a verifiable history for Kilwa, which then supports the oral traditions of other settlements along the coast. The earliest date to be found on the East African coast is found in Mogadishu, on the Menara or tower attached to the Great Mosque, which has a dedicatory inscription of 1238. The Menara is situated on the sea front and probably served as a navigational mark. There was once a similar Menara on Mombasa seafront at a place called Tuaka, near the present Likoni ferry. Two other mosques in Mogadishu also have 13th century dates. Significantly, one of them names the founder as Khusru, son of Muhammad the Shirazi. I don't know whether these mosques remain intact, as this information comes from James Kirkman, who visited Mogadishu in happier times during the 1950s. The arrival of the Shirazi ushered in the so-called Golden Age of the Swahili coast. The apparent simultaneous appearance of coinage and stone-built mosques and houses marks a step change. But the lack of definite documentation to chart the evolution of the Swahili settlements is problematic. Archaeologists have excavated and uncovered the ruined towns, but still many uncertainties remain. Who are the Swahili? There is quite a debate as to who exactly the Swahili are. The word comes from the Arabic word Sahel, meaning coast, and by extension, Swahili has come to mean the people of the coast. Ibn Battuta, an Arab who wrote an account of his travels in the 14th century, was the first to use the word, but he used it purely as a geographical term. The Portuguese, who kept extensive written records, never once used the word Swahili, and always refer to the coastal inhabitants as Moors or people of Mombasa or Malindi, etc. But the word Moor in the Portuguese language simply means a Muslim of mixed parentage. Therefore, the Swahili, as we call them nowadays, are the descendants of centuries of intermarriage and cultural exchange between the local people and settlers and traders, having Arab, Persian, and quite probably Indian ancestry in their DNA. Swahili is the modern name for a people who have always lived along the East African coast and derived a living from the Indian Ocean and its commerce. In similar way, the language Swahili was not formally identified until the 19th century, even though it was surely spoken all along the coast at least 2,000 years ago. But the earliest documented evidence of Swahili as a language is found in 1642 in letters written in the Arabic script to the Portuguese. The new stone buildings of the Swahili towns were modest, as there was no convenient local stone available. Small coral pieces, coral ragstone, bound together with earth and a lime mortar, were the favoured building materials. But mortar and plaster, made from the lime of burnt corals, properly prepared and matured, is of a very durable nature, and that is why so many of the walls and foundations of the Swahili settlements have survived until today. On the East African coast, limestone, consisting of a mix of seashells, sand, and coral, was heated at a high temperature in a kiln until it degraded into a fine ash. Mixed or slaked with water, this ash, known as quicklime, becomes a putty-like substance that hardens on contact with air into a strong mortar. This procedure is thought to have been first used in the Indus region and later taken up by Indian and Roman masons. It is the forerunner of modern concrete. A finer and more diluted quicklime mixture was also used to coat the walls of buildings to give a smooth finish, and artistic patterns could then be moulded into this plaster before it set hard. Traditional lime plaster is still used at the coast to this day, as it allows structures to breathe and does not crack like concrete. The standard stone house plan of the Swahili settlements is borrowed from the Islamic world, but the architecture is plain, which makes tracing specific influences difficult. The flat roofs have almost all fallen in when rafters rotted and collapsed. The rooms are long and narrow, their width determined by the length of the mangrove poles which made up the rafters of the ceiling. The most elaborate structures in the Swahili settlements were always the mosques. A general picture emerges of communities living in a fair degree of comfort and order. In the larger settlements, there were stone-built houses around the mosques, where the wealthiest traders and perhaps the chief would have lived. The rest of the inhabitants lived in simple dwellings which tended not to survive. Behind the residential area, generally built to face the sea, were extensive orchards and farmlands, providing food for the population. Ibn Battuta, in his description of Kilwa in the 14th century, says that the wealthy residents employed slaves to tend these farms, and no doubt they had servants in their houses as well. Ordinary townsfolk would have included fishermen, seafarers, carpenters, masons, food vendors, and other suppliers of everyday needs. There were wells providing sweet water and evidence for washing areas in front of mosques, as well as storerooms and facilities for cooking within the houses, niches for oil lamps and shelves built into the walls of the larger houses. While town walls and the narrow streets, often designed on a slope to maximize natural drainage, represented a degree of civic organization. There is little decoration remaining, except occasionally on the mosques and tombs. All the woodwork has sadly perished. This is a pity, as contemporary eyewitness reports indicate that the woodwork was a particularly impressive feature, with overhanging balconies and ornamented doors. Without the woodwork and decorated plasterwork, it is hard to picture the full splendour and elegance of the Swahili towns as first seen by the Portuguese. Kilwa to the south of Zanzibar was the greatest of the Swahili mercantile towns. Its wealth and influence depended on its control of the gold being exported from the mines located in the interior behind Sofala. Under the Shirazi, Kilwa became rich and successful. But by the 15th century, leadership of Kilwa passed to a new dynasty, and when the Portuguese arrived, the town was already in decline. Mombasa benefited as a result and became the premier Swahili trading centre on the coast during the 15th and 16th centuries. Here is a description of Mombasa at the beginning of the 16th century by a Portuguese eyewitness called Duarte Barbosa. There is a city of the Moors called Mombasa, very large and beautiful, and built of high and handsome houses of stone and whitewash, and with very good streets, in the manner of those of Kilwa, and it also has a king over it. The people are of dusky white and brown complexions, and likewise the women, who are much adorned with silk and gold stuffs. It is a town of great trade, and has a good port, where there are always many ships, both of those who sail for Sofala, and those who come from Cambay and Malindi, and others which sail to the islands of Zanzibar, Mafia and Pemba. This Mombasa is a country well supplied with plenty of provisions, very fine sheep, which have round tails, and many cows, chickens, and very large goats, much rice and millet, and plenty of oranges, and lemons, limes, pomegranates, Indian figs, and all sorts of vegetables, and very good water. The inhabitants sometimes are at war with the people of the hinterland, and at other times at peace, and trade with them, and obtain much honey, wax, and ivory. And here is a description of Malindi, according to the contemporary Portuguese historian de Goes. The town consisted of well laid out streets, flanked by well-built stone houses, some of them of dressed stone with flat roofs. Verandas were built out along the length of the houses and roofed with palm leaf thatch. The interiors were pleasantly painted. The majority of the population were African and wore only a narrow cotton loincloth. The Arabs lived amongst them as the ruling class, the more important of them paying great heed to appearances. The population also included people from Cambay in India, who were primarily concerned with commerce, and who earned their living by trading gold from Sofala, ambergris, ivory, resin and wax, copper and other commodities. Wax was an important ingredient in the cotton cloth industry, used in printing and setting the designs. The Portuguese account also commented on the red silk umbrella with gilded handle, a strange and fantastic object to the European of those days, under which the Sultan of Malindi sat in his richly ornamented chair. The king wore a red silk robe lined with green and an elaborate turban. Accompanying him was a retinue of elders, while a dignified old African man carried his sword of office before him in a silver sheath, and trumpeters and musicians proclaimed his presence. When Vasco da Gama finally left Malindi in 1498, he was presented with a carved ivory trumpet made from a single elephant tusk. This must have been a siwa, a traditional item of Swahili regalia. This was not an empire, but a fluctuating system of independent trading towns, whose influence and wealth ebbed and flowed according to the energies and ambitions of individual leaders, and the availability of trade. Numerous ruins exist along the coast, which perhaps represent the ambitious hopes of an entrepreneur whose ship was wrecked, whose trading venture failed, or who met with an accident and died, leaving only a small mosque or tomb as evidence of what might have been. The main established towns controlled a number of dependent or satellite towns whilst competing for business with other trade centres along the coast. One of the unique features of the architecture of the Swahili coast are the pillar tombs. It is not certain where the idea came from, but they are Islamic in character and were put up to commemorate important holy men or famous leaders. One suggested source is South Arabia, where sharifs, who claim direct descent from the Prophet Muhammad, were much revered, and this custom spread to East Africa. Going further back in history are the examples of Egyptian obelisks and the stela at Aksum in Ethiopia, which may have provided inspiration. The fashion for these pillared tombs continued on into the 19th century. Facilities for prayers and offerings at the site were often provided. The style was simple, the most usual ornamentation being nichework. See this simpler pillar tomb on Pemba Island. The best place to get a feel for what a Swahili town once looked like is at Gedi, near Malindi. At Gedi, you can still see the layout of the town as it once was and imagine the lives of the people who once lived there. Abandoned by its residents and left untouched for over 2 centuries, the ruined town was rediscovered deep in a forest. Realizing the importance of the ruins, a team of archaeologists began to uncover the town and its buildings. The findings were a revelation. Gedi is now a protected monument, a national museum and popular tourist attraction. You can see ruins of mosques, a palace, tombs and many houses. The town is surrounded by an inner and an outer wall, and there is a network of narrow streets and wells. The whole area covers 45 acres and could have housed a population of over 1,000 people. This shows the main gate, an entrance to a large and impressive building in the centre of the town. Was it the palace for a king? Or was it a market or a forum where the people met and traded their wares? No one knows for certain, but I favour the market idea. Inside the building there is a large sunken courtyard surrounded by stone seats, where perhaps the king addressed his people, or perhaps trade goods were displayed on the raised areas to attract custom. At the back of the building are numerous small rooms for storage or residential use. This is a drawing of the mihrab or qibla of the great mosque. Mihrabs were always the most decorated part of the mosques in Swahili ruins. The indentations you see would once have held colourful porcelain plates. Chinese blue and white plates were much prized and used as decorative items all along the coast of East Africa, adorning the pillar tombs as well. These plates were a nod to fashion, used as a simple alternative to the elaborate glazed tilework popular in the main Islamic centres such as Cairo or Istanbul. Chinese plates were usually imported via India. There is a carved border round the pointed arch, and note in particular the stepping of the secondary arches. This stylistic feature is replicated in many of the ruined mosques along the coast. See, for instance, this mihrab from a ruined mosque on Pemba Island. It is not as fine as the example from Gedi, but the design is similar. Here is a plan of a stone house at Gedi. Entering the narrow courtyard of the house at the far side, there is a stone bench where the owner could sit in the evening after prayers to talk with his friends. They would not be invited inside where the women of the house were. The two long rooms marked outer and inner room on the plan were used for meals, and there the lady of the house could entertain her friends. Meat and rice were often eaten off pottery plates. In the two living rooms, the owner kept his most valuable possessions. A carpet from Shiraz, possibly hung from pegs on the wall, and perhaps prized items of Chinese porcelain were displayed in niches. At night, the room was lit by boat-shaped earthenware oil lamps. Behind the inner living room was the kitchen. Here meals were cooked in earthenware pots over a charcoal fire. Tall earthenware jars were used to store millet, other foodstuffs, oil and water. The bedroom and the store were both at the back of the house. The store was entered by means of a ladder which could be pulled down when it was not wanted. The people of Gedi used these rooms for keeping their trade items. Great attention was paid to personal hygiene, with washing facilities attached to the houses and in front of the mosques. It is still something of a mystery why such a large and beautiful town was abandoned and never resettled. Perhaps the raids of the Galla in the 17th and 18th centuries, which devastated the once mighty city of Malindi, also laid waste to Gedi. The Galla were a nomadic people who herded cattle and had no interest in towns or settled farms. During this period, the Galla moved down from Somalia and were a dominant force in the region, causing the settled population to flee elsewhere for safety. The whole area was left to go back to its natural state of wilderness and was shunned by the superstitious Giriama living nearby, who told tales of powerful spirits and magical beings still living deep in the forest. The entry of the Portuguese into the Indian Ocean in 1498 was a disaster for the Swahili trading communities of the East African coast, as new shipping routes disrupted the flow of goods and the Portuguese took control of the trade. Mombasa, the last stronghold of the Shirazi, fell in 1589 and marks the end of the golden age of the Swahili. The brief revival of Swahili fortunes in the 18th century mainly centred in Lamu and Pate, but then appeared the Christian missionaries and the British, who concentrated their efforts in the hinterland, built the railway and largely ignored the Muslim coast. Nearly 60 years now after the end of colonial rule, not much has changed for the Swahili. But the ruins of the Swahili settlements all along the coast bear testament to a once successful and vibrant civilization. I hope you all enjoyed the talk on the golden age of the Swahili, and I would welcome any questions and any information you would like to share. Thank you.
محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وسلم.